In the 1980s, horror games weren't really a genre yet. Games could have an intense soundtrack or maybe a violent theme, but they didn't really look like horror games as we know them to be today. But with the rise of popular horror films like Halloween and Texas Chainsaw Massacre in the 70s, game developers in the 80s saw a unique opportunity to capitalize on that popularity and create adaptations of those storylines and concepts for video games. And I have to say, on the surface level, this idea isn't bad in concept. But in execution, these games turned out to be huge stinkers that didn't see much commercial success, and some even live on in infamy to this day. So why exactly did these games perform so poorly? And why do they continue to have such a bad reputation? So before I get into the details of the games themselves, I also want to call out the video game crash of 1983, which is coincidentally 40 years ago, so happy anniversary, video game crash. This crash was caused by a variety of different factors, so no, the Texas Chainsaw Massacre game did not single-handedly cause the collapse. I actually think that a lot of the same factors that caused the video game crash in 1983 also caused the adaptations of Halloween and Texas Chainsaw Massacre to flop as well. So here is a super quick summary of what caused the 1983 video game crash in the United States. By 1982, there was a saturation of video games being released, which meant that there was only a small window for really big hits. And at this point, there were a lot of different and inexperienced publishers releasing games for the Atari 2600. So this meant that the majority of games being released really weren't very good. And a lot of these really poorly performing games were movie adaptations. Rest in peace, E.T. Because of this, consumers were losing faith in the Atari brand name and were buying less and less. Then add all of this to the burgeoning PC market and you get the 1983 video game crash. So with both Texas Chainsaw Massacre and Halloween releasing the same year, the stars were definitely not aligned for a successful reception. So along the same culturally significant lines, in the 80s, most people still believed that video games were primarily for children and teenagers. And at the same time, many games were still marketed as toys or marketed toward the younger generation.
The fun is back! Oh yes, siree! It's the 2600 from Atari.
The video game that lets you help E.T. get home.
My toy! This new Popeye video game has the boys fighting worse than ever.
There was also mounting concern that video games were infiltrating the minds of the youth, or becoming a source of addiction, or just otherwise harming the development of children. And so much so that there was a rise in legislation across the United States about who should be able to play games.
They say that, I think a lot of the parents say that they're, especially in the arcade parlors, that they're occupying too much of the kids' time, taking their lunch money.
Communities around the country are passing laws banning the video games from their towns.
City officials today announced that video games no longer will be licensed in residential areas, only in commercial and industrial neighborhoods. Officials say they are responding to complaints from parents that children have skipped school or stolen money to play the games and made a nuisance of themselves. One MIT study of more than 800 video game players found no basis in fact for an underlying fear expressed by parents during public hearings that video games lead to violence.
So, with the preconceived notion that video games are for children, and with the rising concern from parents and other adults about how children play video games, it's safe to say that developing video games based on horror films was not the brightest idea in the early 80s. But that is exactly what Wizard Video Games did with Halloween and Texas Chainsaw Massacre. True to its film predecessor, Halloween puts the player in the shoes of a babysitter. The babysitter must shepherd as many children as possible into safe rooms while avoiding being killed or getting children killed by Michael Myers. In the game, Michael Myers runs around with a knife in his hand, and if he catches the babysitter, he decapitates her with a big show of blood spurting from her still moving body. And to make matters worse, the serial killer also kills children with a similarly violent and bloody display. Nothing quite like dead children to send already concerned parents off the handle. But Texas Chainsaw Massacre one-ups Halloween because the player plays as the serial killer, Leatherface. In this early attempt of a reverse horror game, the player must chase young women with a chainsaw and try to kill them for trespassing on his property. To the credit of the publisher, it does appear that Texas Chainsaw Massacre was meant to be marketed toward adults. The back of the box urges them to put aside their childish pastimes and to stop eating dots and chasing ghosts. Unfortunately, this nuance did not break through the existing societal understanding. Because of their violent and controversial themes, stores didn't want to stock Halloween and Texas Chainsaw Massacre. And if they did, they were stocked in the back room or hidden under the counter and only sold upon request. Let me just start off by saying that it's no surprise that the graphical capabilities of the Atari 2600 were unimpressive. But the teams behind Halloween and Texas Chainsaw Massacre really didn't put much thought behind their graphics. The characters in Halloween are designed fairly well, but where I really think the graphics lacked is with the setting. The problem is that there is really no way to tell these rooms apart other than the colors of the walls and perhaps if there's a door or not. Oh, but there is one unique room where the light flickers on and off. But this room is also a huge nuisance because instead of the colors of the room getting maybe a bit darker, you just actually don't see anything. But overall, I think some variability in the rooms would have had a really nice effect on the game. I especially think it would have been nice to have some sort of visual indicator of when you're in a safe room. And also I think maybe some furniture or something else to give some more visual interest to the other rooms would have been nice. Actually, I take that back. I would not have wanted to avoid furniture while trying to run away from Michael Myers with a child at my side. Because heaven forbid the developers make them something you can get stuck on, like in Texas Chainsaw Massacre. Speaking of Texas Chainsaw Massacre, the environment there is pretty basic. The background features are kind of strange. I mean, who would drive a truck the same size as their house? There are also, as I mentioned before, random pieces of junk in the yard that you have to avoid, otherwise your player character gets stuck. But what I found most strange about the design of the game was the character Leatherface. This man is wearing the goofiest frown I have ever seen in my life. And his chainsaw is the same color as the rest of his clothing. Did this man knit a special little sweater for his chainsaw bestie? I don't know what's happening here. The Halloween sound design is really nothing to write home about. There's the sound of your footsteps and the little twinkly jingle that you get when you successfully save a child. And both of these I expected to a certain degree. But what I didn't expect was the blaring sound of the Halloween theme song every single time Michael Myers comes on screen. Which, I mean, is kind of cool for the first couple of times, but after time number 5, I was really starting to get sick of it. And then we have Texas Chainsaw Massacre. In the background of this game, you can always hear the puttering of your chainsaw. And then when you approach a trespassing woman, she lets out this really loud and obnoxious beeping noise. Honestly, none of these sounds add to their respective games. To me, they seem more like superfluous additions added at the very last minute before they release the game. Both of these games have elements that make the gameplay a little bit frustrating. In Halloween, Michael Myers must have teleportation powers, because it doesn't matter if you fled from him from the room on the left, he could very well come at you from the room on the right. And Texas Chainsaw Massacre requires surgical precision to avoid the obstacles in the yard. If you even get half of a pixel too close to any of these obstacles, you get stuck. If you somehow manage to escape the clutches of a rogue fence post and catch up to the trespasser, she seems to escape with the same teleportation powers that Michael Myers has. Finally, the gameplay for both of these games is very repetitive. You either save as many kids as possible, or kill as many trespassers as possible, without much variation between levels or stages. And there's really no storyline for either of them. The player just goes through the same tasks over and over again without any change or a real ending. In Halloween, the game ends when you inevitably die at the hand of Michael Myers. And Texas Chainsaw Massacre ends when you run out of fuel for your chainsaw, and one of the trespassers comes up behind you and gives you a big ol' kick in the booty. Neither Halloween nor Texas Chainsaw Massacre succeeded upon their release in 1983. Cultural factors, including the video game crash of 1983 and the cultural preconception that video games were meant for children, on top of concerned parents, prevented the widespread sale of both of these games. The lackluster graphics and superfluous sound design were aggravating and failed to captivate the player at their best. And the gameplay itself was repetitive and included some very frustrating aspects. All of these factors together hampered the success of these games and gave them both a bad reputation that still exists today. But even if these games aren't necessarily the most exciting or intense games to play, I still think that they're fun little time capsules. If you have the opportunity, I'd give them each a chance at least once for the experience. Thanks for watching. Let me know what you thought of the video in the comments or by dropping a like. And if you'd like to see more content from me, feel free to subscribe. Thank you all so much for your support, and I'll see you next time.